Major funding for this series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by public television stations, and by the Chubb Group of insurance companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers. Additional funding is provided by the George D. Smith Fund, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and other contributors. This program contains scenes of graphic violence. Viewer discretion is advised.
In October 1954, after 9 years of war, French troops left Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh had led the communist-inspired Viet Minh nationalists to victory. A ceasefire agreement signed at Geneva provisionally partitioned Vietnam into 2 zones. Ho's forces were to regroup in the north and leave their families and unarmed comrades in the south. A nationwide election to reunify Vietnam was to be held in 2 years. Colonial rule was ending.
The northern part of the country had been totally liberated. According to the agreement, in only 2 more years, the South, too, would be completely liberated. The people in the South truly believed that there would be national reunification in 2 years.
The United States, which had largely financed the French war, promised not to disrupt the Geneva agreements by force. Vice President Nixon flew to Saigon to dramatize America's support of South Vietnam's new leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, who had rigged a referendum and set up a separate South Vietnamese state.
After the Geneva Conference, the United States pushed the French out of the South and backed Ngo Dinh Diem to organize a government there. Ngo Dinh Diem was a cruel and reactionary tyrant. He used extremely barbaric methods to repress the revolutionary movement and to stifle demands that the Geneva Agreements be carried out.
The Eisenhower administration backed Diem's rejection of the nationwide elections called for at Geneva. With American aid and advisors, Diem strengthened his power using soldiers and police who had formerly served the French.
They arrested, imprisoned, and assassinated former participants of the resistance against the French, and they forcibly registered all families whose sons, husbands, and other relatives had regrouped in the north.
While I was in the north, I heard that people in the south were being killed in droves, among them members of my family. I was very worried, and my heart ached for them. I went to my superiors and volunteered to return to the south to fight in any way I could.
Ho Chi Minh wanted a political solution. So did the Soviet Union and China, who feared a possible war with America. Rural poverty was all too apparent. A decade earlier, a famine in the north had taken an estimated 2 million lives. Raising food production was a priority. The Hanoi leadership launched a program to distribute land to the peasants. The estates of rural landlords were shared out among 3/4 of the peasantry. The political aim was to break the influence of the old landowning class.
A land reform team came from the central government to coordinate the program with the local inhabitants. The people in the area would then be invited to meetings where the poor and landless peasants would describe their situation. In this way, we found out how the rich exploited the poor and landless peasants.
khổ xong ấy, thì chúng tôi đã xã.
With help from the government team, we classified the landlords in different categories. Then the landlords were brought before a people's court set up in the village. Those found guilty of actual crimes were sent to jail.
Following Chinese communist practice, people's courts had to meet fixed quotas of criminal landlords. Thousands of innocent people were arrested, and many, possibly between 3,000 and 15,000, were executed. Alarmed by the turmoil, the leadership curbed the excesses, calling them serious mistakes. North Vietnam's economy, ravaged by war and neglect, was being rebuilt. The Hanoi leadership was coming under increased pressure from Southerners to resume fighting. Finally, in 1959, they decided to back armed struggle in the South.
The first battle took place in Ben Tre province. We attacked a company of the regime's self-defense forces and took over a notorious police garrison. In only 3 hours, without any weapons of our own, we succeeded in capturing 30 guns.
In 1960, the Communist Party created the National Liberation Front, a coalition of Southern forces opposed to the Diem regime. Diem labeled it the Viet Cong. The front called for Diem's overthrow, an end to foreign interference, and the eventual peaceful reunification of Vietnam. The United States sent more aid and advisors.
We continually were amazed at the professionalism, the ability to be good psychologists that these people had. They knew exactly how to deal with the Vietnamese farmer. Now this, the Americans generally never did, and the Vietnamese government might have, but really wasn't that interested. So we found that a whole structure had been superimposed on this province, and it was a Viet Cong structure, a communist Viet Cong structure. They had people at every level, and they were running a shadow government, coincidentally with the government's operation.
To isolate them from the Viet Cong, Diem shunted peasants into fortified villages called strategic hamlets. Many peasants had resented the return of the landlords and the loss of land given to them earlier by the Viet Minh.
There were some very substantial grievances, which these people had. They had been perhaps moved off their land. They were being taxed unfairly. They were promised things which were never delivered. The Vietnamese military would perhaps molest their women, would steal their chickens, in general be obnoxious.
The Saigon government tried to control the rural population as Viet Cong teams assassinated local officials.
They would send in a small squad of people, maybe 5 or 6 men in the middle of the night. They would seize the hamlet chief in his house, haul him out to the center of the hamlet, and convene the whole village to watch this. And then they would cut his head off. They would make him kneel down and they would shoot him in the head, whatever technique they wanted to use. And of course, this frightened the Vietnamese. Because of the insecurity in the countryside, the normal Vietnamese government civil servant, the teachers, the agricultural advisors, could not go into these hamlets. The provincial junkyard was littered with blown up ambulances, blown up education vehicles. They simply put mines in the road, and as the government people went out to a hamlet, the Viet Cong destroyed them, and they put the fear of God in them.
Saigon's government army swept through the countryside in search of Viet Cong suspects. This film, released by the National Liberation Front in 1963, shows government officials torturing suspects by electric shocks and hanging. By now, the Viet Cong force had grown. Their objectives were the capture of government outposts and the destruction of strategic hamlets. Diem's army suffered from poor leadership and internal dissension. In late 1963, the United States encouraged a coup in which Diem's own officers killed him. The Viet Cong at first depended on captured or homemade weapons and arms hidden after the Geneva Agreements. But by early 1964, as the North Vietnamese commitment increased, men and equipment flowed south along an old supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Former Viet Minh soldiers who had regrouped to the north were returning to fight. They counted on growing support from the southern population. Stepping up sabotage activities, they struck at the heart of Saigon, attacking American installations.
Trong quá trình hoạt động ở đó, thì tôi sẽ nắm tình hình toàn bộ các.
When I worked on the docks, I collected information on American facilities, on all their ships and their military warehouses.
Mang cái tính chất là quân sự. Sau khi là
I learned that the USS Card was coming up the river, carrying all kinds of aircraft to kill the Vietnamese people.
nhân dân Việt Nam biến cái căm thù đó thành hành động.
I was able to transform my anger into action when I was given the job of trying to blow up the ship.
Hạm của Mỹ, tôi với một đồng chí nữa mới mang trái, dùng kỹ thuật đặc công.
Using commando tactics, we entered into a sewer,
Trong cái đường cống đó
crawling
thì
along because it was so
có những cái
narrow.
chỗ thì nó lớn, có những cái chỗ nó nhỏ.
Sometimes
Có lúc
we could
là
walk
chúng tôi
by
có thể đi
crouching.
khom về được, có những cái lúc là phải bò. Sau khi đặt xong rồi thì
After we had placed the two mines, I checked the automatic ignition device again.
trong lúc mà
It was 2 a.m. when I finished checking everything. My comrade and I then began to crawl back to the other end of the sewage system.
giờ là trái phát nổ lên. Thì lúc phát nổ là
When the mines
cả cái
exploded
vùng đó
at
điện
exactly
tắt.
3 a.m.,
Điện tắt.
the whole area was blacked
Thì
out,
một cái tiếng nổ dữ dội.
and the two of us were so
làm cho
happy
là anh em chúng
knowing
tôi
that our
rất
mission
là
had been
phấn khởi.
accomplished.
Coi như là cái trận đánh là thành công.
In August 1964, President Johnson reacted to reports of a naval clash in the Gulf of Tonkin by ordering a reprisal air raid.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to take action in reply.
U.S. aircraft were bombing North Vietnam for the first time.
Not until I was about halfway to our target area did I start to realize that this was actual combat. And things that we had trained and prepared for, the eventuality like this, I never really, thought that it would really actually happen. But all of a sudden, here we were, and I was in it.
1964.
I was visiting Quang Ninh province when suddenly I saw a formation of airplanes coming from the sea,
Một cái đội máy bay từ ngoài
flying
khơi
straight
bay
toward the
vào
mining area.
vùng mỏ. Tiếp sau đó là có cuộc đánh nhau.
Then, a fight broke out between the American airplanes and the Vietnamese air defenses.
Và phòng không Việt Nam.
I was hit, and the weirdest feeling. My airplane started to fall apart. I was over strange territory, foreign territory, enemy territory.
Thì sau đó máy bay Mỹ bị hạ.
Shortly thereafter, an American airplane was shot down and its pilot captured.
Và chúng tôi đã
Before
gặp
returning to Hanoi,
cái người
I
giặc lái
met
đó
with this
trước
pilot,
khi về Hà Nội.
Everett
Tên
Alvarez.
là Everett Alvarez. Đó là người giặc lái đầu tiên.
He was the first American pilot taken prisoner in Vietnam.
A decade after the Geneva Agreements, North Vietnam was under attack, its developing economy threatened. A decade during which land under irrigation had doubled, electrical production had increased tenfold. Ho Chi Minh, who had devoted his life to winning independence, declared in 1964, "As long as the country is divided, as long as our compatriots continue to suffer, I can neither sleep well nor eat with any appetite." Ho personified the nationalist struggle, even for Vietnamese who feared communism. He inspired many Southerners to fight.
I'll always remember August 1st, 1964, when this village liberated itself. There were no revolutionary guerrillas or regular forces present. Villagers staged a spontaneous uprising. We were delighted. We convened a meeting of 2,000 people and introduced a revolutionary administration. We organized the people to dig trenches and tunnels to defend themselves against enemy artillery. Everyone dug booby traps and laid homemade mines. We knew that the enemy puppet troops would try to get revenge.
The Saigon government troops faced traps and other primitive weapons. The military force of the National Liberation Front, the People's Liberation Army, drew on experiences gained in fighting the French, paying meticulous attention to detail and planning. American helicopters had given their enemies superior speed and mobility. They devised counter-tactics to wait and lure the helicopters within range. By late 1964, Viet Cong troops were fighting sustained battles against numerically superior and better armed Saigon forces. On December 28th, some 1,500 Viet Cong armed with machine guns and recoilless rifles captured the village of Binh Gia, 40 miles southeast of Saigon. On December 30th, after U.S. helicopters flew in reinforcements, Saigon troops recaptured the village. The battle continued for 5 days. The Viet Cong destroyed 2 South Vietnamese battalions, killing 158 soldiers and 5 American advisors. By March 1965, U.S. Marines were in Vietnam, the first American combat troops to arrive. They had come as allies of South Vietnam, but to many peasants, they were yet another threatening foreign force. Bien Hoa, March 18, 1965. The United States stepped up its bombing of the South, using more napalm and phosphorus bombs.
Vũ khí mà đến Mỹ đó, đa số là vũ khí tự tạo.
Unexploded American bombs and shells were dug up by the old people and the kids, sawed up in order to get to the gunpowder and explosives.
Ở trong xóm đó, kể cả những người giàu và thanh niên đều đi tìm và đào nó lên rồi mới cưa ra.
They then produced various kinds of explosive devices themselves. In each hamlet and village, we had a workshop for producing these devices.
Những cái loại trái nổ.
We unscrewed the detonators first of all, then used a saw to cut the bombs in half. We scraped the powder into 2 large cauldrons bigger than this one here. Next, we melted the powder down into a thick liquid and poured it into a container like this one until it was completely full. We then made a detonator and inserted it here. We placed these mines along the routes we knew the tanks were going to take. When the tanks went by, they would hit this thing here, exploding the mine and causing the tank to turn over.
We had many old people who took part in the fighting. Have you heard of Mrs. Nguyen Thi Ran, who was over 80 years old when she became a military heroine? We had many men and women who were more than 50 years old when they became heroes and heroines in the struggle against the United States. The children were even more active and creative. They mostly used homemade weapons, manufactured precisely to fight the enemy in each area.
South Vietnam since 1961. Vinh Binh Province, April 26, 1965. On July 1st, the Viet Cong mortared the U.S. Air Base at Da Nang. American Marines were deployed to nearby Cam Nay, a cluster of hamlets. They drew fire.
As we started moving, some of the so-called civilians, quote unquote, is on the news, got killed. At this time, some of the Marines used cigarette lighters, and the hooches went up, grenades. Some flamethrowers were brought in. And that was one way to quell the fire from the village.
I told the squatters to approach it on simply a case-by-case basis and use their own judgment, that we were not getting a heavy volume of fire, that they should be able to pinpoint, at least to some extent, the source of the fire.
I don't think that an order had come down to burn the village, but I think it was just something that was carried on through the operation.
The Americans shelled the village as they arrived. Then they burned down the houses, destroying everything. 9 members of my family were killed. I escaped, which is why I'm alive today. But my whole family was wiped out.
Many people were wounded. Where I'm sitting now, one person was shot as she returned from harvesting rice. She was taken to hospital, and there she died.
The Americans came into my house with their interpreters and drove us out. They refused to let us take any belongings with us.
An 8-year-old or a 9-year-old can kill you just as quick as a 25 or a 26-year-old man. Now, these people have been fighting this war a long, long time. Some of these people were actually fighting wars when they were 9, 10, and 11 years old, where back here in the States, the kids are playing cowboys and Indians. Over there, they'd been playing it for real.
We did encounter a problem which was ultimately to become a very difficult situation, in that I'd gotten a report from one of my squads that they had been fired on from behind. It meant either that our search was not sufficiently adequate, or that we were facing some other kind of a problem. And perhaps they had come from some other area of the village and come in behind us or whatever.
I witnessed the destruction because I was fighting there. After our clash with the Americans, my comrades and I ran along the communication trenches to our hidden shelters, where the villagers could help us.
Wherever the Americans went, they burned and destroyed and killed. I didn't see any guerrillas being killed, only villagers.
On that day, they couldn't locate any of us guerrilla fighters. Our unit suffered no casualties at all.
In North Vietnam, villagers and militia now faced regular American bombing attacks. Called Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing had started in March 1965. The bombing was planned to last a few weeks, a few months at most. It continued for more than 3 years.
I was going right up Route 1, north from Thanh Hoa. I had to raise up to go over the hill just a little, and when I did, I was receiving automatic weapons fire right down my nose from some fixed positions, and I never quite even reached my target. And they just shot me to pieces.
The official list of bombing targets grew, from Army and Navy bases and radar sites to railways, roads, bridges, and anything that resembled a military vehicle.
When my head emerged above the rice, in the rice paddy, I looked right down a gun bore. And I didn't have my gun aimed at this guy, so I had to make the decision. Am I going to make a fight? Because this guy was already had a gun right in my head. And I changed my mind. I remember telling the guys I would never be captured, but I changed my mind and I dropped the gun without uncocking it. I ground it in the mud with my feet, hoping they wouldn't find it. But an old one-eyed villager had seen it, seen me with it, saw me drop it. He came up, and while they were forcing me to kneel and tie my arms very painfully behind me, he searched around until he found it. And then he picked it up, and I remember still the water and the mud dripping from it. And he put the barrel between my eyes, and I watched his finger almost as though I were fascinated or hypnotized, and I watched his finger curl around the trigger guard, knowing full well he didn't know how finely tuned that trigger was. And that was the only time out of my entire prison career that I ever wondered for even a millisecond if I were coming back alive or not.
In South Vietnam, American aircraft met less resistance.
Okay, it's about their SimCom. Okay, they should hit now. Okay, look out to the right now. Okay, right down there. Okay, napalm now. There it goes. Ah, look at it burn. Look at it burn.
Military operations included intelligence gathering.
Đổ
alive.
The American imperialists have invaded the South with their troops and have tried to destroy the North with their aircraft. Thus, they have committed untold crimes against the people of both regions. Vietnam is one. The Vietnamese people are one. As compatriots, the people in the North will do everything within their power to support the struggle of the people in the South.
As their troops and supplies moved to the battlefield, Hanoi's leaders repeatedly denied that their army was fighting in the South, claiming that the charge was a myth fabricated by the United States. To stop the flow, America stepped up the bombing campaign. North Vietnam responded by moving its factories into the countryside. The civilian economy was suffering, but the country was being mobilized with Ho Chi Minh's slogan, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." Earlier, Ho's communist allies had discouraged his efforts to reunify Vietnam. In 1957, the Soviet Union even proposed that 2 Vietnams be admitted to the United Nations. But with the North under attack, the aid from communist powers was increased. They sent weapons, fuel, rice, agricultural, and industrial equipment.
We received help from sister countries, from the USSR, from China, which had a stand different from the one she has now. Not only did we enjoy growing international help and support from other socialist nations, but also from the progressive forces in all other countries.
Les 13 et 14 décembre 1966, l'escalade atteignait directement le centre de la capitale nord-vietnamienne. En voici les toutes premières images rapportées de Hanoï. Quatre arrondissements étaient touchés par les bombes. Des quartiers entiers, composés de maisons basses, étaient entièrement soufflés ou détruits par le feu. Malgré les informations transmises par le correspondant permanent de l'agence France-Presse à Hanoï, Washington ne reconnut les faits qu'après plusieurs démentis.
As the bombs were falling, our hearts naturally throbbed with fear. But when that happened, we either carried the stretcher out to bring in the wounded or went out to visit the injured, and our fear dissipated as a result. My experience was that fear arose when you sat there worrying about things. But when you kept yourselves occupied, you lost your fear.
Despite limited resources, North Vietnamese doctors became adept at treating burns. And at removing bomb pellets and splinters. The North Vietnamese called the American pilots war criminals.
One evening of July the 6th, they came around and gave us new pajamas that we wore. And these had numbers stamped. Well, they had stamped numbers on our pajamas. We were always so hopeful and optimistic that this thing was going to end, and we figured, aha, this is step number 1, and we're going to be going home, guys. So we were sort of feeling good about this. And as we started walking. You know, I thought really we were going to walk right around the park. But no, as we got to the opening of a big street, we could see down, and it was just, I mean, this was the New Year's Eve parade. I mean, there's just thousands of people and in stands and along the streets. And as we started the march, I could hear the cheerleaders with megaphones getting the crowd going. And one of the interrogators we call the Rabbit, he saw me and he turned to the crowd and he was leading them in this cheer. The cheer said, "Alvarez, Alvarez, son of a bitch, son of a bitch." So pretty soon the whole cheering section started, you know, and I had played sports before, but this was a different sport altogether. But as we progressed down, the crowd started to press in. And the guards would come along and the interrogator would say, "Bow to the people, bow to the people." You know, I was sort of just trying to keep my head, not to bow, but just trying to head in that direction. And after a few blocks of this, the crowds became uncontrollable and they started throwing things. And then somebody hit me from behind and I just about went out. Next thing I know, I was sort of drowsy and we were led to the infield and sat there, and as they brought us all in, we all made it.
They started with my wrists, with my arms behind my back, and wrapped my arms together under the armpits. Well, the two arms were together, and they just pulled my shoulders out of joint. You know, there wasn't that, and then they did some similar things to my legs. I tried to endure the pain, knowing that an American military man should be able to endure torture until he died, but never to give nothing to the enemy, and never to give anything to the enemy. And I tried my best, and my best wasn't good enough. And during the night, I heard someone screaming in a distance. And I thought, man, they're torturing another prisoner. And I felt so sorry for him, you know. And then I would come back more closely to consciousness and found out it was me I was hearing in the distance. I was the one that was doing the screaming. And they tortured me all night. And by daylight, they had reduced me to such a place that I would give them more than name, rank, soul number, date of birth. And they hurt me pretty bad. They pulled my shoulders out of joint, and they did some things to my legs. But I found out that I was not as strong as I thought. I couldn't be tortured to death, that my will would give before my heart stopped beating. That was very disconcerting. I lived in abject misery for the rest of the time I was a prisoner.
The bombing in the South continued without let-up, but it never stopped the flow of supplies and manpower to the Viet Cong bases. Many bases were tunnels stretching for hundreds of yards underground. Some, like the major Viet Cong base at Cu Chi, only 20 miles from Saigon, were never destroyed.
Thế thì chúng tôi ở tại đất Cu Chi.
We used Cu Chi as a training base and staging area.
Tổ chức cái lực lượng.
We enlisted recruits in Saigon and trained them here in the tunnels. We raised their political consciousness and taught them tactical skills, preparing them for big assignments, such as attacking large enemy hotels. They learned to use automobiles and Honda motorcycles, firing handguns to hit the enemy with a single shot. In the city, we had people who specialized in forging documents. Whenever the enemy produced any kind of document, we were always able to acquire a copy and produce an exact replica right in the heart of Saigon itself.
I lived in Da Nang along with other sisters who participated in the revolution. We organized clandestine activities and provided communication between the revolutionary base area and the city. We carried out political struggles against the enemy.
Viet Cong spies and agents continually passed useful information to the guerrilla bases. Couriers and saboteurs depended on sympathizers in the local population for their protection. If caught, they expected little mercy.
They tried to force me to confess that I was involved with the Viet Cong. I refused to make such a statement, and so they stuck needles under the tips of my 10 fingernails, saying that if I did not write down what they wanted and admit to being Viet Cong, then they would continue the torture. But I was determined to say nothing. I was extremely angry at the enemy, and I loved my country so much. This was because everyday bombs and shells and the blood and bones of my people appeared before my eyes. I was extremely outraged and would never come out with any information. They tied my nipples to electric wires, then gave me electric shocks, knocking me to the floor every time they did so. They said if they did not get the necessary information, they would continue with the torture. 2 American advisors were always standing on either side of me.
Artists, writers, and musicians rallied to the National Liberation Front, whose radio station beamed propaganda to Saigon and beyond. Many actors, dancers, singers, filmmakers, and poets joined in the fight against the Saigon administration and the Americans. Coastal towns and villages in the southern part of North Vietnam were constantly shelled and bombed by American warships and aircraft. People took refuge in tunnels.
We spent more than 2 years building the whole complex. The largest number of people living in the tunnel at any one time was more than 1,000. The lowest number was more than 200.
My house had been bombed, and I had to give birth to my baby in the tunnel. We remained underground for 2 months. There was little food to eat or clothes to wear. There was no firewood to cook with, and little water to drink. All day long, I was going in and out of the tunnel trying to get water for my child.
They dropped napalm bombs, and I was injured. Napalm bombs saturated the whole village, engulfing it in a gigantic fire. When I was hit, the napalm set my whole body on fire. I lost consciousness. Many people died. Their bodies had been torn to pieces. Some of the pieces hung from the branches of trees, and other pieces were covered with dirt thrown up by the explosion. Some people were so shocked by the terrifying scene that they turned around and went back into the tunnel. But then the tunnel collapsed, and they were buried alive.
B-52 bombers had begun to bomb the South in June 1965. By April 1966, they were bombing the North.
L'aviation américaine est une aviation très puissante.
The American Air Force is a very powerful Air Force. and naturally it influenced the battlefield.
Des Américains. Ils voulaient
It was a great trump card. The Americans counted on their Air Force to somehow change the course of events.
le cours des événements.
Ở đây cần nhắc lại một lời nói của tướng, của Chúa Suleiman.
It must not be forgotten that General Curtis LeMay had said that the United States should bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age.
Nhưng rõ ràng là họ đã nhầm
But they were greatly mistaken.
cái cuộc đánh pháp miền
The
Bắc,
destruction of the
tất cả
North, with all the efforts and all the barbarity of Imperial America,
của đế quốc Mỹ
only caused the people to be more resilient,
cho nhân dân miền Bắc càng kiên cường,
more resolute, and their determination to resist and to win.
để chống lại và chiến thắng. Cái điều có ý nghĩa quyết định là chúng tôi
The key factor in the struggle was the opening up of a trail, appropriately called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to link the North to the South.
nối liền miền Bắc với miền Nam. Và tất nhiên là
The United States used every means at its disposal to block the trail, but to no avail.
nhưng mà tất cả thủ đoạn này đều đã thất
The Ho
bại.
Chi Minh Trail
Con đường Hồ Chí Minh
developed day
ngày
by
càng
day,
phát triển, trở thành
becoming
một
a
hệ
network
thống
of roads
đường
over
sắt
which weapons,
để vận chuyển
military supplies,
vũ khí, đạn
and
dược,
tens of
quân trang
thousands of soldiers
và để
were
đưa
moved
hàng
into the
vạn
South
hàng vạn
for combat.
chiến sĩ đi chiến đấu ở miền Nam.
Thế mà vào đến trong đó thì phải
I left the North,
gần 3
taking
tháng,
3 months to reach the South.
gần 3 tháng thì vào đến trong.
On the way,
Thế vào
we
đến,
constantly faced
dọc đường đi
flares,
thì
all kinds of
pháo sáng
bombs
là thả
and
xuống đến,
rockets.
bom thả, rồi chúng dùng máy bay.
We
bỏ
couldn't
bom
stop
tọa độ
for any
đánh
time
phá.
along the route until we had reached our resting place.
Thế đi thì là dọc đường chúng tôi là mưa, gió, rét, đi đến đâu mà theo quy định thì ở đấy đó, căng võng, nằm võng
Then we would sleep in hammocks
ở trên mắc ở rừng.
and begin marching again at 4 o'clock
Ngủ
the
trong
next
một
morning.
đêm đó được, xong rồi đến sáng, là 4 giờ sáng chúng tôi lại dậy tiếp tục.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single trail, but a web of trails, some threading through Laos and Cambodia. They were kept open by armies of women, many drafted into service for 2 years at a time. Throughout 1967, more and more soldiers were moving from north to south every month.
Và họ cũng hiểu rằng anh em
The
miền Bắc
Northern
vào chiến
brothers
đấu
came
là
here
vì
to
cái
fight because of their sense of solidarity and responsibility toward us. After all, this was not their native village, and they did not have to fight here. There were never any problems between us Southerners and
miền
Northerners.
Bắc, miền Nam chúng tôi không có vấn đề gì cả. Anh em du kích chúng tôi á, chỉ đánh những cái
We guerrillas
trận
fought behind the enemy
làm
lines,
cho hậu phương địch nó không ổn định,
disrupting
và
his
chúng tôi
rear.
đánh những trận nhỏ, và chúng tôi xác định rằng có anh em chủ lực đó mới đánh được những trận lớn. Còn anh em
We
chúng tôi
concluded
cái
that
gì
only
là
with
phối
the
hợp,
regular forces would we be able to fight the big battles.
và chỉ cho anh em nó đánh những trận lớn.
The North Vietnamese troops were highly disciplined and tightly controlled. As in the Chinese Communist Army, each soldier belonged to a three-man cell.
When we encountered difficulties, the three-man cell functioned as one. If one of us was killed, the others suffered terribly. And that made us hate the American imperialists even more.
Rất căm thù bọn đế quốc. Quân miền Nam ấy đánh nhau với tôi là
The morale of the South Vietnamese soldiers was not very high.
tinh thần bạc nhược.
This was because they were only mercenaries, afraid to die.
Nó là tinh thần yếu kém, sợ chết.
The South Vietnamese Army, despised by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as puppet troops, consistently sustained heavier casualties than the Americans.
In combat, we found it easier to fight Americans than the puppet troops. Besides being rather naive and clumsy, the Americans were well disciplined. They would not open fire until they received orders.
Tôi đã giết được 3 thằng Mỹ khi mà
I killed 3 American soldiers when the American forces attacked Diem Hung.
Bố trí ở đó, tôi bố trí ở đó. Thì Mỹ ra là hai
We
bên
waited
xung
for
phong
them
nhau.
in ambush.
Thì chúng tôi dùng lưỡi
We
lê
engaged them in close combat, and I killed them with my bayonet.
3 thằng Mỹ đó. Thế mà sau khi ấy,
After this battle, my morale was very high because I had contributed to the liberation of the South.
thấy là rất là phấn khởi.
We had a slogan, to fight the Americans, you must cling to their belts. If we fought them at a distance, we suffered a lot of casualties.
Trong khi tác chiến thì chúng tôi tác chiến với quân Mỹ, tức là đụng độ với Mỹ.
Having fought against American troops many times, I came to the conclusion that they had a lot of bombs and shells, that they were very powerful as far as war materials were concerned.
Chiến đấu không mạnh. Quân Mỹ chiến đấu không mạnh. Bởi vì nguyên nhân thứ nhất,
But they did not fight very well at all.
Mỹ là
They
về
moved
mặt
very
cơ
slowly
động chậm.
and really were not that mobile.
Cái tác phong cơ động rất chậm.
In both North and South Vietnam, daily life accommodated to the rhythms of war.
We always knew when they were about to drop their bombs. For example, in the morning, they usually arrived about 10 o'clock, just after breakfast. Then they took a break and went back to their bases for lunch. Then they came back to drop their bombs again at about 3 in the afternoon. Since this was the routine, we tailored our schedule accordingly. We began our surgery about 5 in the morning and took a break at 9 or 10. When the bombs didn't fall on time, we felt extremely uncomfortable, wondering why they hadn't fallen yet. This wasn't fear. We simply wanted the bombing to be over with so that we could get back to our work.
By 1968, Soviet-made missiles and anti-aircraft batteries ringed Hanoi.
At that time, we were filled with fervor. I can tell you, there's something strange about the Vietnamese. They could never remain long in a bomb shelter. Whenever an airplane was shot down, everybody, including doctors, rushed out to look at it.
By 1967, nearly every military target in the North had been damaged or destroyed. The bombing had not broken North Vietnamese morale, nor stopped the flow of men and supplies to the south. Operation Rolling Thunder had failed.
They had spread the hostilities over the entire territory of our country. It was absolutely normal and necessary for us to mobilize all our forces.
et militaire
political and military,
pour
in order to carry on the struggle and to reach
mener
final
la lutte
victory.
jusqu'à la victoire finale.
In January 1968, 20,000 Northern troops moved south. They were poised for a fresh, ambitious offensive, the Tet Offensive.
This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for this series was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by public television stations, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers. Additional funding was provided by the George D. Smith Fund, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and other contributors. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Vietnam, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. TV series chief correspondent Stanley Carno has written the companion book Vietnam, A History, published by the Viking Press and available in bookstores and libraries.